decade since this committee held its first, and I would say only, hearing on the Kanan renovation project. As a project with an initial budget of more than $752 million, it's important for this committee to conduct appropriate oversight. It's our job to ensure the project is completed on time and to the standard befitting a building essential to our history and the day-to-day operations of Congress. The Kanan building is the oldest congressional office building. Its doors opened for the first time in 1908. And over a century later, it is home to the offices of more than 140 members of Congress, several committee hearing rooms, the historic Kanan caucus room, the rotunda, as well as space for congressional support services. Going into this project, the Kanan building had reached a critical stage in its life and was in desperate need of a comprehensive renovation. To put the building's age in historical perspective, when construction of the Kanan building was authorized, there were 45 states. Of those, 7 states were less than 15 years old. When the building opened, it had what were considered modern amenities at the time. That meant that the building had a telegraph office, but no parking garage. It had a forced air ventilation, but no air conditioning. Although a parking garage and air conditioning were subsequently added, by the time this project began, the building was plagued by operational, safety, health, and environmental issues. Defects to key elements of the building, like the HVAC systems, plumbing systems, mechanical and electrical equipment, life safety and fire protection systems, and exterior stone, had been accumulating rapidly. Ad hoc fixes to these issues were often intrusive, disruptive, as well as expensive. In addition, as a 100-year-old plus structure without a prior major renovation, the Kanan building required a variety of upgrades to windows, doors, lighting, and insulation to comply with accessibility requirements and energy consumption standards. Since our last hearing on this topic in 2009, significant progress has been made on Kanan, including the completion of the planning, design, and pre-construction stages, as well as the commencement of actual construction. I'm also pleased to note that as of the beginning of this Congress, newly renovated office suites in 25% of the building are occupied. As I mentioned back during the 2009 hearing, the Kanan building is a historic building and a national treasure. We are here taking care of it right now, but it belongs to the American people, and they are the ones paying the tab. So I'm eager to hear from our witnesses about the progress that's been made now that we're in phase 2 of the construction. Most of the occupants of the renovated office suites that I've heard from indicate that on balance, their experience in the renovated space has been positive. However, there are a number of issues with the renovated space that I'm looking forward to exploring during this hearing. These include issues related to the HVAC system, the operation of the elevators, and improved communication between the building management and its occupants. I'm also interested in discussing the reasons behind any cost overruns, justification for any increases in the project's budget, and getting clear answers as to what the final project cost will likely be now that we're right around the halfway point of the renovation. With that, I would like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for any comments he might like to make.
Thank you, Chairperson Loughran, and thank you to, I'd like to give a special thanks to our colleague, Ms. Davis, who announced she was not going to run again. I certainly hope it wasn't me, but clearly it could have been Mr. Aguilar. I'd like to recognize you for your service and recognize you for the work we've been able to accomplish together over the last few Congresses. So thank you for everything you've done. Welcome to our witnesses. And today's hearing on the Kanan office renovation is something that I'm happy that the chairperson agreed to. This decade-long, $750 million project is the most expensive project ever taken on by the architect of the Capitol. And it is imperative we deliver a building post-renovation that not only meets the needs of the members and staff and visitors of today, but for many decades to come. That is a goal that both Republicans and Democrats, not just on this committee, but in this Congress, are aligned on. As the chairperson said, this building was built in 1908 as the first House office building, named after Speaker Joseph Gurney Kanan, a member of Congress from my home state of Illinois, Mr. John Shimkus's district in Danville, Illinois, to be exact. He served in this institution for 46 years. Subsequent to the completion of Kanan, as Congress's needs grew, the Longworth and Rayburn House office buildings were built, and of course later 2 additional buildings acquired, the Ford and the O'Neill buildings. However, as our footprint expanded, the last significant renovation of Kanan was in 1932. Starting in the early 2000s, there was a realization that many of the building systems were starting to fail and were well beyond their useful life. As discussions progressed, decision was made to renovate the entire building in the phased approach that we're seeing today. This approach meant the project would take longer and cost more, but would be least impactful to Congress's ability to conduct business. Fast forward to today, phases 0 and 1 are complete. Congress has appropriated $565 million, and we are 9 months into phase 2. In my role as the top Republican on this committee, who has had many conversations and meetings with members about the Kanan building, I believe I'm uniquely suited to offer my observations today. I will start with saying that much of the completed phase 1 space looks great. The corridors seem brighter and cleaner, and the 5th floor member suites are now desirable office space. And speaking from a former staffer who worked out of 5th floor Kanan in the late 90s, I can attest it looks much nicer up there. And phase 1 was delivered on time in conjunction with the biannual transition moves. Unfortunately, not all of the feedback has been positive. I personally had to spend a significant amount of my time trying to help members in Kanan that have had major issues with heating, cooling, and lighting systems. I joked with my staff a minute ago when Chairperson Lofgren talked about AC being installed. And there are some members that really think AC still hasn't been installed in the Kanan office building. I can't understate how much of an inconvenience this has been for offices and has impacted their ability to carry out their work. We must do better. I'm aware of the projected cost overruns of $75 to $110 million. And I also understand that one of the drivers for that increase is the enormous amount of change orders. My expectations for both the architect of the Capitol and Clark Construction moving forward are improved transparency, not only with this committee, but also with building occupants, better coordination with stakeholders, such as the United States Capitol Police and the House CAO, in an effort to reduce the amount of required change orders in the out phases, and a commitment to deliver for Congress an office building that is going to stand the test of time and be a model for future campus renovations. Thank you again, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. If other members have opening statements, by unanimous consent, they'll be put into the record. I'd also now like to welcome our witnesses. Joining us this morning are Acting Architect of the Capitol, Thomas Carroll, Architect of the Capitol Inspector General, Christopher Falla, Government Accountability Office Managing Director of Infrastructure Operations, Terrell Korn, and Clark Construction Mid-Atlantic Region CEO, Brian Apt. Acting Architect of the Capitol, Thomas Carroll, was appointed Acting Architect in August of this year. As Acting Architect of the Capitol, Mr. Carroll is responsible for facilities maintenance and operation of the Capitol Building, the Supreme Court, Congressional office buildings, and the grounds of the Capitol. Mr. Carroll has worked for the Architect of the Capitol since 2009, when he was hired as Deputy Superintendent for the House office buildings. In 2011, he became the agency's Chief Financial Officer, and in 2018, he was promoted to Assistant to the Architect. Before his time at the Architect of the Capitol, Mr. Carroll served in the U.S. Armed Air Force, most recently as Commander of the 11th Civil Engineer Squadron. Architect of the Capitol Inspector General Christopher Falla was appointed as third Architect of the Capitol Inspector General in April of 2017. He's responsible for promoting the integrity, efficiency, and effectiveness of Architect of the Capitol operations and programs. Mr. Falla and his staff conduct independent audits, evaluations, and investigations, and recommend policies to detect and prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. Before joining the Architect of the Capitol, Mr. Falla completed a 26-year naval aviation career, retiring at the rank of captain. During his last assignment, he was detailed as Director for Technical Assessment Directorate, leading 19 engineers conducting inspections and evaluations on major acquisition, defense programs, military facilities, and overseeing hotline complaints and congressional inquiries. Carroll Dorn is Managing Director of Infrastructure Operations at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Dorn has held his current position since 2012 and has worked on physical infrastructure issues for the GAO since 2001, following many years as a civil engineer and construction manager. He's responsible for the GAO's second largest budget and a team of over 60 employees and contractors to provide facilities management, emergency preparedness support, and safety and security services for all GAO facilities. He also provides consulting advice on facilities management and construction issues to Congress, including this committee, as a witness at our last hearing on this topic in 2009. We welcome you back. And finally, Clark Construction Mid-Atlantic Region CEO Brian Apt is here representing Clark Construction. Mr. Apt is responsible for day-to-day operations of Clark's construction operations in the Mid-Atlantic region. He's been with the company for nearly 35 years and has provided executive management for more than $2 billion worth of construction operations in Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. Notable projects under his leadership include the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center renovation and expansion, and the National Park and U.S. Department of Transportation headquarters. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, and that all written statements be made part of the record, and without objection, that is ordered. I'll remind our witnesses that their full written statements will be made part of the record, and that the record will remain open for at least 5 days for additional material or for you to answer our questions. We have a system where we ask that your testimony be about 5 minutes. When the orange light goes on, it means you've just got 1 minute left, and we ask that you try and summarize so that you can stay within your 5 minutes. So first, let me turn to you, Mr. Carroll.
Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you. As an engineer and public servant for more than 30 years, I am honored to be here. But it occurred to me, as was mentioned, I was in the Air Force serving both in Korea and the Middle East and in war zones, and that was challenging. But I have to confess, I'm a little nervous today before this distinguished body, so I would appreciate if you'd forgive the jitters, my first time jitters here. But in all seriousness, this is a very important project with historical significance, and I fully understand and appreciate the magnitude of the Kanan Renewal. I want to thank my colleagues sitting beside me, each of whom has an important role in the project. The Kanan Renewal is one of the Architect of the Capitol's largest and most complicated projects in its 226-year history. Many of Kanan's systems are original, dating back to 1908 or even earlier. In 1908, having indoor plumbing was considered an extravagance. Materials were delivered by horses, and construction workers wore bowler hats instead of hard hats. In the 110 plus years since then, as the world changed around it, we have updated the Kanan building to the best of our abilities to meet the needs of members. But every system has its limits, and every system has a lifespan. As we move forward with the project, we encountered serious challenges: limited building records, advances in technology, security enhancements, and code changes added to the project scope. In addition, investigative demolition, a best practice, could not be done in an occupied building. But with our largest and most complicated phases behind us, this is what we know. The rigid schedule developed to accommodate the 2-year congressional move cycle is extremely challenging. Early identification, review, and incorporation of scope changes is critical to containing costs, and yes, the project's overall cost will increase. Some will say the Kanan is already too expensive. I can construct a whole new building for less than the budget. And my response is, yes, you probably can. A brand new office building would definitely be easier and less costly, but displacing 142 members, 3 hearing rooms, and tearing down a historic structure to build a new facility was never really an option. The team is operating under difficult constraints. I commend the staff and contractors who are working hard to upgrade this facility for Congress, and I thank them for their service. But moving forward, this I can promise you. We are committed to the successful completion of this project, and lesson learned are being incorporated into future phases. We are encouraging a more empowered management team to elevate project concerns as soon as they are discovered, and implementing hard deadlines through a new change management process. This process alone will help us avoid delays and premium costs associated with change orders of future projects. I mentioned earlier the costs will be increasing. A detailed analysis of the project's working estimate is ongoing. Furthermore, an integrated cost schedule risk analysis final report is expected later this fall. The project team will use the final results of these two reports to recommend a revised program strategy to the executive working group. Until the risk analysis is complete and the final reports issued, we must refrain from making cost assumptions on future funding needs. Additional changes will be presented to the EWG in the coming months. Changes could include combining phases, restructuring deadlines, or moving additional offices out of the building for longer periods of time. The strategy may also reveal additional mitigation efforts in need of your support. Again, until further analysis is complete, it is imperative that we refrain from making cost assumptions. With your support, this project will successfully meet congressional needs, while also being a good steward of the taxpayer dollars. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We'll turn to you now, Mr. Falo, who are you recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, good morning. I am pleased to testify today regarding oversight of the renovations of the Kanan House office building. Since becoming the architect of the Capitol Inspector General in April of 2017, I've implemented many of the changes I testified that I would take when I sat before you in May of 2017. My written statement highlights these changes and the work my office has done over the last 2.5 years, but today I would like to concentrate my oral statement on work completed concerning oversight of the Kanan Renewal project. 2.5 years ago, my audit division consisted of 2 auditors, and at the time were not equipped to conduct audits of large, complex construction projects, as well as audit many other programs and projects at the architect of the Capitol, while still fulfilling statutory requirements. In fact, due to my limited audit staff, I was forced to suspend an audit on the Kanan Renewal project last summer and find another way to provide oversight of this $752.7 million construction project. Since that time, with the help of many congressional oversight committees, including the Committee on House Administration, we have grown the audit staff from 2 to 5 auditors, and most recently completed a year-long search for an independent contractor to aid us in conducting construction audits. I'm happy to report that we are now partnered with Kanan Company to begin 2 Kanan construction audits this year. The first of these 2 audits was announced August 13th and is scheduled to have a final report published in April of 2020. The objective of this audit is to assess the effectiveness of Phases 0 and Phase 1 contract modifications. Our second Kanan Renewal audit of the year was announced yesterday, and we'll have Kanan Company auditing the project's invoices. Our objective here is to assess the Kanan Renewal project's invoices for Phases 1 and 2, and to ensure the cost and payments were made in accordance with contract requirements, AOC policies and procedures, and industry standards. Our goal with this newly formed relationship is to conduct 2 audits per year under this contract until the Kanan Renewal project is completed. These audits will account for 50% of my audits for the year. Other audit areas could assess the Kanan Renewal project's labor costs and look for product substitution or include any other guidance the committee wishes for us to review. In addition to these audits, the Audit Division has continually fulfilled the explanatory statement accompanying the fiscal year 2016 Legislative Branch Appropriations Act obligation that instructed the AOC OIG to provide the committee a report on the Kanan Renewal project quarterly, which has since been changed to semi-annually. Our 7th report of my tenure is due out at the end of this month. In these reports, we provide an assessment of 7 categories that we feel would be important to the committee. These 7 categories are safety, security, schedule, budget, client satisfaction, contract management, and risk management. Within these reports over the last 2 years, we have cautioned about growing costs stemming from change modifications and client requests, uses of personnel from other jurisdictions to supplement contractor work, and the use of contingency funds from other phases to supplement the cost of prior phases. Additionally, when it was discovered that Phase 1 was trending over budget, we requested that the AOC provide the OIG with a recovery plan that would keep the project within the planned budget. I contracted to have this recovery plan reviewed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. However, after many delays and changed delivery dates, the recovery plan was provided post-Phase 1 and was of no value and therefore not reviewed. In July of 2019, I requested an estimated cost update of the Kanan Renewal project and received a new working estimate on July 5th. In preparation for this hearing, the AOC has shared that the project was trending to run $75 million to $100 million over budget, or 10 to 15% above original cost estimates. Current briefings that I have had with the Kanan project managers have projects increasing approximately $79 million, or 10.5%. I believe that this is a conservative estimate, especially with requests for equitable adjustments in Phase 1, possibly adding as much as $26 million to this new budget estimate. Additionally, the contingency rate, currently set at 9%, is expected to increase. The final percentage rate will not be known until the cost and risk assessments are completed this fall. My staff and I have reviewed a draft Kanan renewal budget estimate with project managers line item by line item and found little or no room to de-scope the project further without a change in schedule, security, or staffing. In closing, I have placed an emphasis on audit work to oversee the Kanan renewal project and believe continuation of our Kanan semi-annual reports to Congress will be an effective tool to provide transparency, while Cotton & Company's 2 construction audits per year aid me in fulfilling my obligation to provide oversight of this important and costly project. I look forward to working with Kanan project managers to gain greater insight into the raw data that will help me provide meaningful recommendations. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll turn now to Mr. Dorn. You're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to come here today and join in this discussion about the Kanan House office building renovation. In spite of regular appropriations by Congress and good maintenance by the architect of the Capitol, there came a time when the Kanan building's infrastructure was just worn out and no longer compliant with numerous codes. The best way to preserve this asset and protect the people who use it every day was to fund a major renovation, and that's just what Congress did. Chairperson Lofgren, as you may remember, just a little over 10 years ago, I testified before this committee about this project at a very early design stage, and GAO recommended at the time that the construction estimate was much too preliminary for funding and that finishing the design was necessary in order to get a better idea of budget needs. Your comments were something along the lines of, it's important that we adequately map out the program before we begin the actual project. Very appropriate. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that that happened. Sometime later, the AOC reports the budget was set at the same $753 million that we had discussed. The AOC then began the very prudent exercise of trying to adjust scope and design to that budget. And even though the planned duration of the project doubled and the design was not complete, they attempted to hold to that same budget and start construction in 2015. In 2018, they performed a cost and schedule risk assessment that confirmed there was a high likelihood that they would still finish within budget, but their consultant also warned that inaccurate or overly optimistic assumptions about their ability to mitigate project risks could lead to higher costs. Phases 0 and 1 are now substantially complete, and Phase 2 is underway. Some of the risks that the project team anticipated, such as hazardous material abatement, have occurred, and cost or schedule mitigation efforts may not have been as successful as anticipated. Based on current projections provided by the construction team, it appears that without a significant reduction in scope, the project will be under significant cost pressure that could make it very difficult to complete this renovation within the allotted budget. Ongoing efforts by the AOC to perform a new cost and schedule risk assessment are a best practice and an excellent step in determining what it's going to take to finish this renovation and preserve the historic Kanan building for another 100 years. Chairperson Lofgren, that concludes my statement. Thank you for your time. I'm available to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and we'll turn now to you, Mr. Abb, for your testimony.
Yes, thank you. Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the renovation and renewal of the Kanan office building. My name is Brian Apt. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Mid-Atlantic Region for Clark Construction Group. We are an American-owned and operated company headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland. Today, we are one of the largest privately held, U.S.-owned contractors in the nation with more than 4,000 employees in offices and job sites across the country. In 2012, Clark partnered with Michigan-based Chrisman Company to form the Clark-Chrisman Joint Venture, or CCJV. Chrisman is known for its work on numerous historic renovation projects. Our joint venture brings together our company's combined talents to support the Kanan Renewal project. The project was conceived as a 13-year program aimed at modernizing the Kanan House office building while preserving its historic character and ensuring its efficiency, safety, and sustainability. CCJV is responsible for the construction of the renovation work in collaboration with the architect of the Capitol, the third-party design team, and members of the team. The architect of the Capitol was truly innovative in establishing a process to encourage teamwork and problem-solving by all parties. From the outset, the project partners committed to a one-team approach. We and the other stakeholders committed to work under a common charter to further one mission: to create a 21st century building that preserves the 20th century historic fabric of this national treasure. Moreover, as we have carried out our construction activities, we have sought always to keep the safety of those who use the Kanan building and the safety of our workers first, and to minimize any disruptions to the important ongoing operations of the Congress. The Kanan Renewal project was planned to be delivered in phases organized around 2-year congressional cycles. Following a 2-year design phase, the renovation proceeded as follows. Phase 0 was the enabling phase and ran from January 2015 to November of 2016. This phase consisted of putting in place the infrastructure backbone for the renovation, much of it in the basement. Phase 1 was constructed between January 2017 and December of 2018. It included renovations to the west side of the building along New Jersey Avenue. This phase was the largest and most complex of the above-grade phases. Phase 1 included numerous specialty areas like the historic 4-story rotunda, the sizable caucus room, budget hearing room, Homeland Security hearing room, and the food servery. Phases 2, 3, and 4 are scheduled to be completed in 2-year periods between January 2019 and November of 2024. They each involve renovations similar to those in Phase 1, although each involves a smaller overall building area and fewer specialty spaces. We are well into Phase 2 and have made positive and significant progress. I am proud of the notable successes we have delivered so far. The initial phase, Phase 0, was completed on time and within budget. Phase 1, the largest and most ambitious phase, was completed in time for the opening day of the 116th Congress. This was due to the Herculean effort of the entire team, especially our subcontracting partners and hundreds of craft workers whose dedication and hard work, much of it at night, on weekends, and holidays, enabled us to open Phase 1 in time to welcome members of Congress and their staffs. We achieved this despite challenges the team faced with unforeseen conditions in the 110-year-old Kanan building and with changes required by the owner. And during each phase, we and the other team members have worked together to incorporate lessons learned, improve performance, and meet our mission more efficiently. It is important to note that as we sit here today at approximately the halfway point of this 13-year program, we are on track with the overall schedule as originally envisioned by the architect of the Capitol at the outset of the program 7 years ago. The team has certainly experienced challenges. However, despite those challenges, the Kanan Renewal 1 team has completed each of the phases so far in time to meet congressional cycles. This is a significant and important accomplishment. We understand the trust placed in CCJV and the entire Kanan Renewal team to preserve the historic fabric of the Kanan building while delivering these important renovations in a manner that meets the expectations of the architect of the Capitol, key stakeholders such as each of you, and many members of the public who visit the Kanan building. We are honored to be working on this landmark project and supporting the important work that all of you do as members of Congress. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss this important project, and I look forward to answering any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much for that testimony, and to all of you for your testimony and your work. I would turn now to the ranking member of the committee for questions that he may have for the witnesses.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for your testimony. Mr. App,
Yes, sir.
according to the AOC-IG's first report from last year on Canon Renewal, the AOC blamed overages on Clark for deviations in scheduling, changing work methods, late submission of mock-up completions, and incomplete shop drawings. I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that. What are your thoughts?
Sure, thank you. The cost overruns that have been incurred today are really driven by, as you saw in my testimony, really unforeseen conditions in this 110-year-old building. You know, one example of that is the openings in the basement walls, which could not be discovered until you demolished an existing slab. And once those openings were discovered, it was discovered that they were not properly supported when they were built 110 years ago, nor were they of the appropriate size to support the new mechanical systems in the basement. And so areas like that, unfortunately, were unknown to the entire project team until they were discovered during the project.
Okay, Mr. Carroll, what do you think?
So the changes that we experienced, as Mr. App pointed out, a lot of the project was, and we said this going into it, unknown. And I said in my opening statement that unfortunately in an occupied building, it's a highly complex historical structure occupied, we were unable to do any kind of investigative demolition. And what this means is that many of the conditions behind the walls were unknown until we were actually able to open it up. I would also say that in addition to unforeseen circumstances, there were also areas where between 2009's original project requirements identification and the 2012 design, there were technological advances and security enhancements that also needed to be added to the project scope as we got into construction, and that also presented some areas where we needed to make changes.
Okay, well, Mr. Carroll, thank you both for your responses. In February of 2016, Mr. Carroll, the AOC-IG released a report saying that the AOC had completed the second Canon Renewal project's integrated cost schedule risk assessment with the GAO's guidelines in 2015. The results showed that the overall project, including phases 1 through 4, was likely to finish on time and within budget. Will you please elaborate on why, if the AOC was complying with those best practices, the project went over budget and has changed so much in scope?
So I think at the time that second cost analysis was done, there are a couple of contributing factors. One, again, the unknown conditions that were experienced in Phase 1. Keeping in mind that Phase 0 was an infrastructure phase of the project, operating mostly in unoccupied spaces of the building. And Phase 1 represented the first phase where we began to get into the occupied spaces of the building. So at the time that cost risk analysis was done, I believe, and GAO can confirm, that we did validate that we had an 80% confidence level that it would fall within the projected budget. But again, as I have stated, so many of the unknowns, until we actually started to get into Phase 1, were still unknown at that time. And I think I would also agree with GAO's assessment that perhaps we were maybe a little overly optimistic on our ability to execute some of the mitigation strategies that that were identified during that risk assessment.
Mr. Fela, in February 2016, your predecessor reported that the AOC was complying with the guidelines for best practices for cost estimating and project scheduling. Since then, we've seen a lot of the overages as discussed. I'm happy to get your opinion really quick on how Clark and how the AOC are responding to some of the issues in regards to change orders. And really, my concern is, and I'm assuming this will be a concern for you as the IG, as this project moves forward, is a complete explanation of why the change orders exist. Simply saying various unforeseen and owner-requested changes for $5.2 million is something that's going to beget more questions. So how can the IG work with Clark and with the AOC and with us to ensure that we have more specificity, more specific issues addressed when it comes to such large expenditures?
Well, thank you for your question, Congressman. I believe what we're currently doing now, if you look at it, Kanan, having Cotton and Company looking at modifications, for example, in phases 0 and phase 1 will give us an idea of how those modifications were approved, if they were approved correctly, and if the modifications that took place were within guidelines and should have been made. Going forward, I believe that the AOC has put in a process now that will take a better look at modifications, have cutoff timelines on when those modifications can be presented, and that will also bring down the cost and also help alleviate many of the modifications. That change process was something that, upon my arrival here and noticing, I brought to the architect's attention, and it's now taken a little bit of time to implement, but I think it's going forward and is the correct way to do business.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'd recognize the other Congresswoman Davis from California. We're so happy that Congressmember Davis is recognized for her 5 minutes.
That was clarified, right. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate that. We know how critically important this is. We're talking a lot about cost overruns, and within our oversight responsibility, I just wonder about the assumptions that you're dealing with as you think and work with these overruns. How are they being paid for? Are they being diverted from other funds? I think this is an important issue for us to try and understand.
So let me take that, ma'am. The Congress has been very supportive and generous in appropriating dollars for the construction or renovation of the entire Kanan project. And thus far, the appropriations that have been used for the project have been earmarked for various phases. And thus far, what we've done is use those funds, and all those funds that were appropriated for the Kanan project have been directed at the Kanan project through phase 1. And so when we talk about these additional costs due to changes, they were somewhat foreseen in the budget in that there was a portion of the budget that was earmarked for contingency. And so thus far, we have not had to adjust the requests, and Congress has appropriated the dollars needed to complete up to phase 1, and in fact appropriated dollars for us to start, which has already been mentioned here today, phase 2. And I think going forward, as I mentioned in my opening statement, our analysis of the current working estimates, along with the integrated cost schedule risk analysis, will allow us to fold into that analysis the now previously unknown, now known conditions that need to be changed for future phases, and update our assessments of the current risks to the project, and that will allow us to arrive at a new budgetary figure that we can, of course, then share with the Congress for your support.
I know, Madam Chair, because it seems to me that as you're talking, that there still has been a significant diversion of funds from other projects that perhaps were not part of the contingency. And I think that's just something for us to track and be careful about, because the ledge budget, I think for all of us, is low. I mean, we've looked at a number of issues that really do affect members and their districts, and I just want to be sure that there's an understanding of that, and that it is very transparent, which I think there's still some confusion about that. I certainly can understand, we can all understand, that actually it's usually less costly to construct a house than to remodel it entirely. And there are often surprises, you know, that's clear. But on the other hand, it feels as if as we go forward, trying to find a better way to assess that within a time frame is important. And I know that, I think, Mr. Dorn, you spoke to this, and Mr. Art, if you want to speak to it as well, because if the basic assumption is that the money is going to be there no matter what you find, and that's a kind of a black hole that we don't want to deal with. Yeah. Anybody else want to comment on this?
Sure, I'd be glad to comment. You know, as I stated in my testimony, we have now completed the most challenging phase of the Kanan. And we are hopeful that most of the deviations that the 110-year-old building has, hopefully we are now much smarter about those today because, as was explained in some of the testimony, you know, the destructive testing prior to the start of the project just was not an option for the project. And so now, having completed the first phase, I think the knowledge of the whole team of what the building consists of that was constructed, as I say, 110 years ago, is now known. And so now those details can be put into the future documents so that then as the job is then finalized for the future phases, it will contain the information that we now have learned from the first phase.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that you're in a position to scale back on anything? I know you mentioned that, you know, in order to do that, you run into other problems when you start trying to de-scope it or what. Are you at that point?
Well, it's hard for me to comment because it's really based on the mission, but as I understand from the Inspector General's testimony that, you know, it has looked at areas that can be scaled back, and with the desire to make this a building that's going to last for another 100 years, that there's probably not a lot of opportunity to scale back the program that the building is based on.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here. Quite a project. I grew up in a construction family. I still have family members involved in commercial construction, especially in government contracting. That is a unique niche market, right? It's especially when it deals with government agencies or the Corps or someone, there are unique challenges there. And I have never been on a construction project where there wasn't unforeseen conditions, whether it's new construction because of foundational issues, design issues, or scope changes. Change orders are just a way of life in any construction project, and I can imagine the scope of what you're dealing with of unknown, undocumented changes to buildings, et cetera. So I'm sympathetic to these changes. Mr. Dorn, based on other projects you've reviewed, how does this project compare, especially as it pertains to the challenges that you've seen with other projects, and are they less likely to occur in the future phases of this project as far as the challenges we've faced and how we've attempted to overcome those challenges?
Right. So I would say that, as Mr. App said, you've uncovered a whole lot of the unforeseen conditions in this first phase. So you're probably going to see some of the same things, but if you're able to get these design bulletins and things incorporated into the future phases and don't need to pay for them as later change orders out of schedule, affecting the schedule, then I think you can reduce some of the costs going forward. So that's about that. Renovation projects are usually messy, as you mentioned. It's not unusual to have 15 to 20% change orders, cost increases. But the project already had some contingency built in, and I would just caution that as we do the refunding of the project, that we adequately fund that contingency. If you don't use it, give it back. But we don't want to keep coming back to the well, right? That's not very good.
Are the efficiency savings from what we learned, especially being over the most complex portion of the renewal? You mentioned efficiencies, lessons learned, there'll be some cost savings. Are those enough to mitigate increased cost of the change orders?
No, I think it's what we've seen, and Mr. Apt has some great examples of lessons learned being incorporated in his statement. I think there's no way they can overcome that, but it can reduce future cost increases.
Do you anticipate that the scope of the project will need to be tailored in the future?
If sufficient funds aren't available, you're going to have to find some way to reduce the scope. I'd hate to be in phase 4 if that happened.
I appreciate that. Mr. Carroll, on that, if Congress should not provide additional funding that's needed, what would change about the scope of the project?
So that would make it very challenging for us, to be perfectly frank. I think the team has done just a superior job early in the development of the design to use value engineering techniques to provide the best value and to engineer any improvements in both process and constructability. So that's already done, and as what has already been said, both by GAO and our partners in the Inspector General, is I think we are really at the point at which the de-scoping of anything else would probably start to impact the overall project. But I will say that if we get to that point, then we would have to address it. And the architect of the Capitol would certainly take the approach of we're here to ensure that the facility, the building, meets the needs of Congress, meets the needs and mission of the members and constituent services. So any scope changes or de-scoping of the project, should it have to occur, would be applied through that filter. So that at least that the end product, if we ever got to that phase that you potentially suggest, that at least in the end that members and member offices would be maximized in that effort.
All right, thank you. Mr. Apt, real quickly, I've never worked on a project that was as long in duration as this, 10 years. Even on some of the smaller projects, the concern was the volatility of cost of products and supplies. How does that weigh into you guys going forward, especially over such a long period of time?
Sure, thank you, and that's a great question. And when the overall budgeting was put together, it was discussed with the architect of the Capitol, and essentially we carried a contingency, an escalation contingency in the numbers. Obviously, nobody really has a crystal ball on what materials are going to do 10 years out, so we agreed to a percentage that was then carried within the budget to cover anticipated escalation.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Apt, thank you for your detailed explanation of what's been going on and the work of Clark Construction, which of course has a storied history in our community. You explained a number of the causes for different changes, the discovery of hazardous materials, some of the changes in requests from Congress for different kinds of restaurant services and stuff like that. What do you think is the single greatest challenge you faced so far, and how did you or are you overcoming it?
Well, the greatest challenge so far is really a lot of the items you just mentioned. Is during phase 1, it was really the timing of those changes. And if we were aware of those changes at the very beginning of the phase, we can incorporate them into the plan and the process for the job. And the most challenging aspect is when we get those changes midstream or late in the program, and we have to try to incorporate those into the work. But that's why, I'm very excited about the future phases 2, 3, and 4, to where we're incorporating a lot of those lessons learned and knowledge that we've gained from phase 1. And in my testimony, I noted kind of 3 lessons learned where we've been able to really move up some of the work based on knowledge of having completed that phase 1.
Is the renovation now proceeding on schedule, and will phase 2 be done in time for the 117th Congress?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, well, this is good to know. And are you on site, or how frequently are you on site?
I am not on site, sir, but I typically am on site about every month or month and a half.
Who is the direct manager for Clark on site?
We have a large staff of about 40 people, but gentleman with me today is Joe Hogan, who's our division president, who's involved on on a weekly basis on the project.
Okay. Let me come to Mr. Fela. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. In your testimony, you mentioned needing to suspend a 2018 audit of the project because of staffing problems that you were having in the audit division. Do you feel that you now have the resources necessary to oversee the Kanan project?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, I do. We're currently using Cotton & Company, who's a independent construction audit firm that will do this construction audits, and we're going to do 2 a year on Kanan until Kanan is finished, and that's going to help alleviate some of the strain that was put on my staff that did not have the expertise or the numbers to do the oversight.
Gotcha. Of the contract modifications that we've seen, what portion have been necessary and unavoidable, and what portion have actually been avoidable and perhaps could have been anticipated?
So what Cotton's looking at currently is going to be just that. They're looking at the modifications for Phase 0 and Phase 1. I, at this time, cannot give you an honest answer on what was proper or improper to do for modifications. I just know that there's a lot of them. About 54% were client-driven modifications of the cost that was driven up by those. I think the process, again, that the AOC is putting in place will help tamp that down, and I'm hopeful that Cotton & Company will recognize and provide recommendations that could offset those problems in the future.
Okay. Mr. Carroll, let me come to you. Serving on the House Administration Committee must be a little bit like what your job is, because members will come to us with particular kinds of gripes and complaints that they've got. And one that I hear commonly is that the offices are too hot or they're too cold. They can't control the temperature. What is the cause of this, and are we moving in a direction where we might hear a little bit less griping about that?
So let me first start by saying that members of the committee that hear these complaints just pains me. We should be on top of these before they get to your level, and so let me just start by saying that. I think with regards to some of the issues that we hear about, in particular from Phase 1, they break down into kind of 3 buckets, one of which is this HVAC, or too hot, too cold situation. So our team has been working very hard, and we too have heard those complaints, and they've worked very hard to try to correct the situation. I believe that the reason for it in the first phase was, again, because of the late nature of many of these changes. The systems were not ready for testing and evaluation when the members started to move in.
And forgive me for interrupting, but my time is about to be up. Can you just add a note about the elevators too, because that's the other thing.
Absolutely, and we're aware of that, sir. And I think the team, again, has worked with this, and we are incorporating those lessons learned to prevent that happening in future phases.
Okay, so in other words, we're making progress in terms of the slowness of the new elevators.
The new elevators going in will be delivered as scheduled, and it's my understanding that all the items associated with the existing elevator situation have been resolved. But we can check into that, sir, and I'll get back to you.
If we could follow up, that'd be great.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dorn, you had talked a little bit about the change orders and the contingency. Can you talk about some other projects? What typically should a contingency be for a project of this scope, of this age?
As I said before, it's not unusual for a renovation project to start off with 15 to 20% contingency. One that's this difficult, I would have probably tended towards the upper end of that, and that's probably the best advice I can give you right now.
Mr. Carroll, from the position of kind of lessons learned, can you talk a little bit about contingency and what we should look toward in the future?
So obviously, contingency is programmed and budgeted into the project to address unforeseen conditions and constructability issues and scope changes. And what I would say is that setting the proper amount gives us that confidence level, and that is using GAO's best practice of the cost risk assessment in order to arrive at that. Also, because of the importance of delivering member suites in each phase by at least December of the move cycle year, we also do the integrated cost schedule risk analysis. So we look at risks as they impact the cost, and we look at risks as they impact the schedule. And the mitigation strategies that report suggests and then are ultimately approved is what then ultimately sets the contingency. So I would, as I said in my opening statement, I would really like to make sure that the team has full visibility and analysis of these two reports, the working estimate analysis and the risk analysis, before we come back with a revised budgetary figure.
Sure. I guess what I'm trying to also ask is, less specific to this project and more specific to improvements on this campus. What should we be looking at in the future? I understand you want all the data, all the information before we, and I know the back and forth between a contingency. You don't want it too high because that signals that there's a lot of unknowns, or that maybe the contractor has a little more wiggle room than we may like. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is the contingency that was set was clearly inadequate based on the age of the building, given what we know now and the work that was done on phase 0. So I guess what I'm asking you to give the committee and to give me is, can you walk me through what we're going to learn from setting new projects outside of Kanan, and what that contingency might be, or things, lessons that the committee should keep in mind as we sharpen our pencils and look to those projects in the future?
Sure, and it's important to also note that every project on this campus is slightly different. I mean, you can well imagine the different spaces, the different aspects of historical nature, occupied versus unoccupied spaces. I can assure you that as a result of a previous GAO audit that looked at our project cost estimating, we have adopted the risk analysis as part of the general practice. So when we offer our annual budget request, which includes projects not only here in the House office buildings, but across campus, those projects have all gone through a rigorous cost estimating process. For projects over $10 million, they go through the risk analysis, which helps us better define and refine the contingency amounts. And so it involves those requests have the construction, management, and contingency all part of the request.
I appreciate it. Mr. Carroll, also for you, you mentioned in response to Mr. Raskin that the concerns you've received are in 3 buckets. He had mentioned HVAC, and I assumed the other one was elevators. What's the 3rd bucket?
So I had heard about elevators, but I put that into the general repairs bucket. But the 3 were, we had heard about HVAC, the new lighting system, and what I call general repairs, which often many of those were contractor warranty and punch list items that we are working to conclude.
Okay, understood. Members have also received some conflicting information on, I'm going to put this in the general bucket that you described, on a wall that separates the chief of staff from the reception area. Can you talk a little bit about what that policy might be? Are folks allowed to hang things? Folks routinely want to hang things, showing and displaying their districts and the communities in which they come from. Are there restrictions on which walls can have things hung in the newly renovated suites?
So the design consideration for that particular division wall is essentially a solid wood wall. And so, yes, we would not want folks to be hanging things on that wall. However, sir, I have heard that complaint, and we're looking into that to see if there's methods that would accommodate the requests, or potentially even design changes in the future that would allow that to happen. So I'm aware of it, and our team is looking into it.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I am looking forward to the completion of the audit I think we'll know more when that is done. But there are concerns that, according to the report we've received so far, that over half of the cost is because of scope changes. And that's really not something that you hope to see in a project. Now, it looks like a large proportion of those, in terms of cost, were security related, and we certainly don't want to, not only for the well-being of the people who have offices there, but the public don't want to have an insecure facility. But the real issue, I think, is to get control of what we're going to have and then budget for it, and to prevent change orders, because there's a premium cost with change orders. So I'm wondering whether we feel that the management changes that we've made will incorporate the known changes so that we can eliminate these change orders that are so costly. Mr. Carroll.
I too welcome the audit, and this particular one that Chris mentioned earlier is going to be focused on the changes, and hopefully also, as with all our audits and working with our partners, we'll receive some recommendations that will help us going forward. But to your point, ma'am, the lessons learned from phase one, the change orders were categorized as three major things: unforeseen site conditions, and these types of change orders are somewhat unavoidable. Again, I mentioned...
well, if I could follow up, and there's a press
ma'am.
report today, and I'm not, it may or may not be correct, but that some of the unforeseen conditions should have been foreseen. There's a report in that an outside expert and former EPA official is quoted as saying specifically, it shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone that there would be PCB in the caulk. This is an old building. There's things that, there's no plans. There's just things you can't anticipate that, things might be missing, but an old building has some known unknowns. And are you confident that we've built in those known unknowns into our plan so that we don't have change orders to deal with them?
So that's what I'm actually excited about, is that the phase one allowed us the opportunity to see where a lot of these known unknowns, we knew about it, we just didn't know the amounts or the locations in many places, and we can reasonably infer that some of those patterns will replicate in the future phases. And we've informed the contractor, and in the initial base bid of phase two, and in some bulletins that have been issued, have incorporated that earlier. And Mr. Apt already suggested and said earlier this morning that getting those change orders early is key. The other thing is the what we call scope changes, or user-requested changes, as Mr. Apt has pointed out. And these are the things that you've already mentioned, security changes or enhancements that are new or different than when the project was first conceived and budgeted in 2009 and designed in 2012. Again, I'm pleased that these changes have now been identified and rolled over or incorporated into future phases, which will help to contain, although they will cost more to the project, at least we will contain the cost of the premium and acceleration dollars that we did have to pay on phase one.
Well, I just want to make sure that what we know has to be changed is built into the base budget. The changes that have been made, it's the first hearing we've had in a long time. And some of them were unavoidable. The life safety issues, unavoidable. Some of them might have been discretionary. We might make a choice, but at this point, those changes have already been made and can't be undone. That bell cannot be unrung. We just want to make sure that we're sitting on this in a very aggressive way to keep the costs down going forward. And, I've been involved when I was in local government, in projects that involved old things, and, it's expensive. You get some surprises sometimes, so that's really not an excuse to have 54% of cost overruns relating to change orders that were requested by the owner. So that's a concern that I have. Mr. Davis has an additional question that he would like to ask, so I will yield to him at this point.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Carroll, I didn't get a chance to ask you a couple other follow-up questions. You know, you've mentioned there's been some testimony about the reduction in scope of the project. You know, the GAO report mentions the window project being shifted over to a larger window project versus being part of the original Kanan renewal estimates. So with that reduction in scope, do you think it's going to have any of those reductions, in your opinion, going to have an impact on building occupants, or will they all be kind of just unknown to the members who operate out of Kanan?
That's a great question. And as I said previously, I think it's important to realize that we have designed a project to renovate the Kanan House Office building that meets the needs of Congress, meets the needs of members and constituent services. And that is paramount. And so any scope additions or reductions always go through that filter. And so our goal is to make sure that at the end of the day, when the members are occupying the building, that their needs to conduct their mission, your mission, is met. And so we do focus our scope changes on the areas that, when necessary, on the areas that will have least impact. When there is an impact, and Chris has already mentioned that we've instituted a new change management process, and when there is an impact to members, we will be bringing changes of that sort when there's a significant impact to the executive working group for review and decision.
Well, thank you. And as you can tell from some of the questions on the committee today, relaying that information to our teams, both the majority and the minority, could be helpful in us addressing some situations that may be brought to us as members. Just like any other construction project, built a house years ago and had a punch list after that was completed, and you hope and pray the contractor doesn't move on to bigger, brighter, newer projects before those last few things are done. With some of the completed phases, I know there's been a punch list that's been put together in conjunction with Clark and with the AOC. What's the timeline for completing that punch list that exists on the previous phases that are complete?
So it's my understanding, Congressman, that we are down to approximately 200 items, with under 10 of those punch list items being associated with member offices. I have been told, and I know our partners over at CCJV are working very hard. I've been told that a majority, well over 95%, will be completed by the end of this month, with the remaining items.
Who's completing them? Are you completing them or CCJV?
No, CCJV is responsible for the punch list and warranty items.
There's nothing the AOC is doing with that punch list. It's a contractor?
No, if it has been declared a punch list item, then it is the contractor's responsibility to take care of it.
All right. How are they coming along, Mr. App?
As Mr. Carroll mentioned, there's about approximately 150 to 200 punch list items remaining, and we're working very diligently to complete them. The most challenged aspect is really access to them. It's now in an occupied building, and we're very respectful of the work that's going on within the building, not to disrupt that. And so right now, we're working with the AOC to come up with the best way to access those items so that we can do them most expeditiously.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here today. That concludes my questions. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll just close by expressing the hope that some of the complaints that we have received in terms of HVAC systems not working, emanating loud white noise, lights that go off intermittently and don't go back on that are supposed to be motion activated, the elevators that don't work, that seem to be out of sync with the algorithms they don't call, that those are on the punch list to get fixed. I'd like to know, I am now in my 8th month as chair of this committee, and I am glad that we haven't had review of this project in the 8 years prior to this hearing, and I want to keep on top of what's happening. So I'll look forward to this audit and expect that we will review that audit with the appropriate personnel, either in a hearing or workshop or in an informal way to keep on top of this. We don't want any additional unforeseen costs involved with this. So with that, we will adjourn this meeting, recognizing that we have 5 legislative days to submit additional questions. And we thank you all for your participation.